The howling wind tore through the Montana mountains, its icy fingers clawing at Mike Anderson's cabin walls. Inside, the retired wildlife ranger sat motionless, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Beyond his back door's frosted glass stood an impossible sight. A massive grizzly bear, her fur matted with blood and ice, desperately shielding two tiny cubs from the storm. Their eyes met through the glass, and in that moment, Mike saw something he'd never forget, a mother's plea for mercy. "Will you open your door to save a desperate mother bear and her cubs?" Subscribe to witness a story of survival, trust, and the incredible bond between man and nature that will leave you in tears. The thermometer outside Mike's window had stopped working hours ago, the mercury unable to cope with temperatures that hadn't been seen in Montana for half a century. The weatherman had called it the storm of the century, but Mike knew better. In his 30 years as a wildlife ranger, he'd seen nature's fury firsthand. This was something else entirely. This was nature's judgment. His fingers traced a scar on his left cheek, a souvenir from his last encounter with a grizzly 15 years ago. The memory still haunted his dreams. Yet here he was, watching another bear through his door, this one desperate enough to seek human help. The larger cub barely moved, its tiny body nearly buried in the snow, while the smaller one pressed against its mother's leg, whimpering softly. Mike's hand trembled as he reached for his phone. Protocol demanded he call Fish and Wildlife Services, but the roads had been closed for days. By the time help arrived, it would be too late. The bear swayed on her feet, her massive body weakened by what looked like gunshot wounds. Dark blood had frozen in patches across her brown fur. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, his breath fogging the window. The bear's eyes never left his, and in them, he saw something that shook him to his core: intelligence, desperation, and a mother's fierce love. She could have easily broken through his door, yet she stood there, waiting, choosing to beg rather than force her way in. The smaller cub collapsed. Mike's heart stopped. The mother bear let out a low, mournful sound that seemed to pierce the very walls of his cabin. Without thinking, he grabbed his emergency medical kit from under the sink, the one he kept stocked out of habit since his ranger days. His hands moved automatically, gathering blankets, his satellite phone, and his tranquilizer gun. "I must be out of my damn mind," he muttered, reaching for the door handle. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to stop. One swipe from those claws could kill him instantly. But something deeper, something that spoke to 30 years of protecting wildlife, wouldn't let him turn away. The moment he cracked open the door, the wind hit him like a physical blow. The bear didn't move, didn't growl. She simply watched him, her massive body trembling from cold, blood loss, or both. The smaller cub wasn't moving at all now. "Okay, Mama," Mike said softly, using the calm voice that had served him well during countless wildlife encounters. "Let's get your babies inside." He moved slowly, telegraphing every motion. One wrong move and those powerful jaws could end him in seconds. The bear's breath came in ragged gasps, creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. As Mike inched closer, he could see the extent of her injuries: at least 2 bullet wounds, one in her shoulder, another along her flank. Poachers, he realized with a surge of anger. They'd been plaguing these mountains recently, growing bolder as the winter drove wildlife closer to human settlements. The larger cub stirred, letting out a weak cry. The mother bear's head snapped toward the sound, her protective instinct momentarily overwhelming her exhaustion. Mike froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. But when he looked into her eyes again, he saw something that defied everything he knew about these powerful predators: trust. She was choosing to trust him. Mike took a deep breath, knowing that what he did next would either be the bravest or the last thing he ever did. He bent down slowly and carefully, reaching for the motionless smaller cub. The mother bear watched, her massive head tracking his every movement, but she didn't intervene. The cub was ice-cold in his arms, its tiny heart beating so faintly he could barely feel it. "Come on," he said to the mother bear, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Follow me. Let's get you all warm." As he backed toward his door, the bear moved forward, nudging her other cub ahead of her. The larger cub stumbled, weak from cold and hunger, but managed to stay on its feet. Mike's mind raced with questions. How would he treat their wounds? What would he feed them? How long before they recovered enough to return to the wild? But as he crossed the threshold, the mother bear limping behind him with the remaining strength she had, Mike knew those questions would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was survival. He had opened his door to 3 dying animals, breaking every rule in the ranger's handbook. But looking at the trust in that mother bear's eyes, he knew he had made the only choice he could live with. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing out the howling storm. In the warm light of his cabin, Mike looked at the extraordinary scene before him: a massive grizzly bear, 2 tiny cubs, and a lonely ex-ranger, all brought together by desperation and trust. What happened next would change all their lives forever. The warmth of Mike's cabin felt surreal after the bitter cold outside. The mother bear swayed unsteadily on her feet, her massive frame casting long shadows in the firelight. Mike cradled the smaller cub close to his chest, feeling its faint heartbeat against his hands. The larger cub huddled near its mother's legs, shivering violently. "Easy now," Mike murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. He had dealt with injured wildlife countless times during his ranger days, but never like this. Never in his own living room. The mother bear's eyes tracked his every movement as he slowly knelt by the fireplace, still holding her cub. Years of experience had taught Mike that the next few moments were crucial. One wrong move, one sudden gesture, and those powerful jaws could snap shut with deadly force. But the bear's eyes held something beyond mere animal instinct, an almost human understanding of the situation. Mike gently placed the smaller cub on a blanket near the fire. Its fur was crusted with ice, its tiny body barely moving. The mother bear let out a low whimper, a sound so filled with worry that it made Mike's chest tighten. She took a stumbling step forward, then another, before her legs gave out entirely. She collapsed near the fireplace, her breathing labored. "You've done your part, Mama," Mike said softly. "Let me help now." He reached for his medical kit, moving deliberately and slowly. The bear's eyes never left her cubs, but she made no move to stop him as he began examining the smaller one. The cub was male, probably no more than a few weeks old. His body temperature was dangerously low, and his pulse was weak. Mike worked quickly, rubbing the cub's tiny body with warm towels, trying to restore circulation. The other cub, also male, had managed to crawl closer to its mother, seeking her warmth. As Mike worked, his mind raced with questions. What had driven this mother bear to seek human help? The bullet wounds told part of the story, but there was something more here. Bears were naturally wary of humans, yet this one had chosen his cabin, had trusted him with her cubs. A soft growl made him freeze. The mother bear had lifted her head, her eyes now focused on something beyond Mike's shoulder. He turned slowly, following her gaze, and his heart nearly stopped. Through the window, barely visible in the swirling snow, a beam of light cut through the darkness. Someone was out there. The mother bear tried to rise, her protective instinct overriding her exhaustion, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She let out another growl, this one tinged with desperation. Mike moved quickly to the window, drawing the curtain shut. "It's okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the bear or himself. "You're safe here." The smaller cub suddenly stirred in his hands, letting out a weak cry. The sound seemed to energize its mother, who finally managed to push herself up into a sitting position. Mike watched in amazement as she gently nosed each cub, checking them over with maternal care that seemed almost human. "You need a name," Mike said softly, keeping his distance but maintaining a calm, steady voice. "Can't keep calling you a mama bear." He studied her face. The intelligence in her dark eyes. "Luna," he decided, "because you came to me in the night." The bear, Luna, lifted her head at the sound of the name, her ears twitching slightly. The larger cub had begun to show more signs of life. It was shivering less violently now that it was near the fire. "And these little guys," Mike continued, "they look like Rocky and Scout to me." Luna's wounds needed attention, but Mike knew he couldn't approach her with anything resembling a weapon, not yet. Trust was fragile, especially with a mother protecting her cubs. Instead, he focused on keeping the fire strong and providing warm water in a large bowl, which Luna eventually lapped at cautiously. Hours passed like this, in a strange dance of cautious movement and growing trust. The cubs grew stronger with warmth and rest, though the smaller one, Scout, still worried Mike with his labored breathing. Rocky, the larger cub, had even managed to explore a few feet from his mother before scrambling back at every unfamiliar sound. As the night deepened, Mike found himself talking softly to Luna, sharing stories from his ranger days. It was foolish, he knew, talking to a bear as if she could understand, but something in her gaze made him continue. He told her about the bears he'd helped, the ones he'd lost, and the day he'd finally hung up his ranger hat. "Never thought I'd have bears in my living room," he chuckled quietly. "But here we are." Luna's eyes met his, and for a moment, Mike felt a connection that defied explanation. She was more than just a wounded animal seeking shelter, she was a mother fighting for her children's survival, and she had chosen to trust him. The light he'd seen outside hadn't returned, but Mike couldn't shake the feeling that their sanctuary wasn't as secure as he'd hoped. Tomorrow, he'd need to treat Luna's wounds, figure out a way to feed them all, and face the reality of harboring 3 bears in his cabin. But for now, in the quiet hours before dawn, he watched as Luna curled protectively around her cubs, their breathing finally steady and strong. Mike settled into his armchair, close enough to monitor them but far enough to give Luna her space. The fire crackled softly, casting warm shadows across the unlikely scene. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something extraordinary was happening. A barrier was breaking down, not just between man and beast, but between loneliness and purpose. As his eyes grew heavy, Mike watched Luna gently nuzzle each of her cubs. Scout and Rocky snuggled closer to their mother's warmth, their tiny paws twitching in sleep. In that moment, Mike realized that by opening his door to them, he had opened himself to something he never expected to find again, a chance to make a difference, to protect, to care. The night had brought him 3 unexpected guests, but as Mike finally drifted off to sleep, he couldn't help but wonder if they had brought him something far more valuable, a reason to believe in miracles again. Dawn broke over the Montana mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. Mike stirred in his armchair, his body stiff from sleeping upright. The events of the previous night crashed back into his consciousness as he heard a soft whimper from near the fireplace. Luna was already awake, her dark eyes watching him intently as she nursed her cubs. Mike moved slowly, careful not to startle them. The fire had burned low during the night, and the cabin's temperature had dropped. As he added more logs, he assessed his unusual guests. Luna's wounds had stopped bleeding, but infection was a real concern. Rocky seemed stronger, attempting to play with his brother, but Scout's breathing still worried Mike. "All right, Luna," Mike said softly, reaching for his medical kit. "We need to take care of those wounds." He pulled out antiseptic, bandages, and a local anesthetic, supplies left over from his ranger days. Luna watched him wearily, her muscles tensing as he approached. The morning light revealed the full extent of her injuries. The bullet wounds were deep and angry, with red lines spreading from them, the beginning of infection. Mike's jaw clenched in anger. The poachers had shot her and left her to die, not caring about the cubs who depended on her. He was about to move closer when Scout suddenly went limp, his tiny body convulsing. Luna let out a distressed roar that shook the cabin's windows. Mike's heart stopped. The cub wasn't breathing. "No, no, no," Mike muttered, rushing forward. Luna's protective instinct flared, but something in her seemed to understand. She watched trembling as Mike gently picked up Scout. The cub's body was cold, and his heartbeat was faint. Mike had treated wildlife emergencies before, but never one so small, so fragile. He began chest compressions with 2 fingers, desperately trying to remember the proper pressure for an infant bear. "Come on, buddy," he whispered, tears forming in his eyes. "Don't give up." Luna pressed closer, her huge head hovering over Mike's hands as he worked. Rocky whimpered, pawing at his mother's fur. 1 minute passed, then 2. Scout remained motionless. Mike's vision blurred with tears, his hands shaking as he continued the compressions. He couldn't fail, not now, not after everything they had survived. Then suddenly, Scout gasped. His tiny chest heaved, and his eyes fluttered open. Mike almost collapsed with relief. Luna immediately began licking her cub, her massive tongue gentle against his tiny frame. "That's it," Mike said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's it, little fighter." He sat back, watching color return to Scout's face. The cub's breathing was still labored, but he was alive. The crisis had changed something between Mike and Luna. When he approached her again with the medical supplies, she didn't growl or pull away. She seemed to understand that he had saved her cub's life, that he could be trusted. Mike worked carefully, cleaning her wounds and applying antibiotic ointment. Luna flinched occasionally but remained still. The bullets had gone clean through, which was both a blessing and a curse. There was no need for removal, but the wounds would take time to heal. As he worked, Mike's mind wandered to the years he'd spent alone in this cabin after retiring from the ranger service. He had chosen solitude, letting the quiet of the mountains fill the emptiness in his life. But now, watching Luna tend to her cubs, feeling the weight of responsibility for their survival, he realized how much he had missed having a purpose. "You know," he said to Luna as he finished bandaging her wounds, "I used to think I was done with all this. Figured I'd lived enough excitement for one lifetime." He sat back on his heels, meeting her intelligent gaze. Guess life had other plans. Rocky had grown bold enough to approach Mike, sniffing curiously at his boots. Scout, though still weak, had managed to nurse and was now sleeping peacefully against his mother's side. The scene was so domestic, so contrary to everything Mike knew about wild bears, that he had to remind himself of the danger they were still in. The poachers might return. The wounds might get worse. The cubs might not survive. But looking at Luna's trust, at Rocky's curiosity, at Scout's fighting spirit, Mike knew he couldn't give up on them. He spent the rest of the morning preparing food, oatmeal mixed with honey for the cubs and whatever meat he could find in his freezer for Luna. His stores wouldn't last long, but for now, it was enough. Luna accepted the food gratefully, and Mike's heart swelled as he watched Rocky and Scout eagerly lap at the warm oatmeal. As the day wore on, Mike found himself talking more to Luna. He told her about his years as a ranger, about the animals he'd saved and lost, about the loneliness that had driven him to this remote cabin. She seemed to listen, her eyes following him as he moved around the cabin, her expression almost understanding. "Never thought I'd say this to a bear," he chuckled, sitting near her as the cubs napped. "But I'm glad you found me." Luna's response was to gently nudge his hand with her nose, the first time she had initiated contact. Mike's breath caught in his throat at this display of trust. The moment was interrupted by Scout's wheezing cough. The cub was still fighting, but Mike knew they weren't out of the woods yet. Luna immediately turned to her cub, her concern evident in every movement. "We'll get through this," Mike promised, watching as Luna soothed her cub. "All of us together." And in that moment, surrounded by the unlikely family he'd found in the midst of a storm, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Outside, the wind had died down, but the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside, man and bears rested, healed, and slowly learned to trust. It wasn't the life Mike had planned for himself, but as he watched Luna tenderly care for her cubs, he realized it might be exactly the life he needed. A sharp crack echoed through the forest, sending birds scattering into the steel-gray sky. Mike's head snapped up from where he was changing Scout's bedding, his ranger instincts screaming danger. Luna, who had been dozing by the fire, was instantly alert, her massive body tensing as she pulled her cubs closer. Mike moved silently to the window, keeping low as he peered through a gap in the curtains. The morning mist clung to the trees, but through it he caught glimpses of movement, at least two figures moving through the underbrush. The metallic glint of rifles made his blood run cold. "Poachers," he whispered, his suspicions about Luna's wounds finally confirmed. She let out a low growl, her eyes fixed on the same spot Mike was watching. These weren't random hunters. They were the ones who had shot her, who had forced her to seek refuge at his cabin. Rocky and Scout sensed their mother's tension, huddling closer to her massive frame. Scout's breathing, though improved over the past few days, still carried a concerning wheeze. Mike knew they couldn't run. Not with Luna still healing and Scout so fragile. Another crack sounded closer this time. Mike's mind raced through options. He could call for help, but the nearest ranger station was hours away. He could try to scare them off, but armed poachers weren't easily frightened. As he weighed his choices, Luna's reaction caught his attention. She wasn't just afraid, she was enraged. Her eyes tracked the movement outside with an intelligence that sent chills down Mike's spine. She remembered these men, remembered the pain and fear they had caused her, but there was something else in her behavior, something that spoke of a deeper history. Mike crept to his bedroom, pulling out his old ranger logbook. Flipping through the pages, he found what he was looking for: reports from the past year of a bear family being targeted repeatedly by poachers. The mother bear had reportedly attacked one of them, leaving distinctive claw marks across his face. "That was you, wasn't it?" Mike whispered, returning to Luna. She met his gaze, and in that moment, he understood. She hadn't randomly chosen his cabin that night, she recognized him. From his ranger days, when he patrolled these woods, she had sought him out specifically, knowing he might help. The realization was interrupted by voices outside, low but clear enough to hear through the cabin walls. "The tracks lead this way. That bear's worth a fortune on the black market." "What about the ranger?" "He's retired. Alone. Won't be a problem." Mike's jaw clenched. He reached for a satellite phone, then stopped. The poachers would hear the call going out. They'd either run or attack, and he couldn't risk either with the cubs so vulnerable. Luna rose to her feet, her movements still stiff from her healing wounds, but powered by maternal fury. Mike placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the muscles rippling beneath her fur. "Not yet," he whispered. "Trust me." He moved quickly, gathering Scout and Rocky into a hidden alcove behind his wood storage. Luna watched, understanding seeming to dawn in her dark eyes. These men wanted her, but they didn't know about her cubs. That was their advantage. The footsteps grew closer. Mike positioned himself near the door, his old ranger rifle in hand. Luna took position on the other side, her massive body coiled like a spring. They were no longer just man and bear, they were protectors, united by a common enemy. "Check the windows," one of the men whispered outside. "Johnson swears he saw movement." Mike caught Luna's eye across the room. She gave him a look that seemed almost human in its complexity, trust, determination, and a fierce protective instinct that matched his own. They had formed a bond over the past days, one forged in the fire of survival and mutual understanding. The door handle slowly turned. Mike raised his rifle. Luna's claws scraped silently against the wooden floor. The moment stretched like elastic, ready to snap. The door burst open, and chaos erupted. The first poacher barely had time to register the scene before Mike's rifle was in his face. The second raised his weapon but froze at the sight of Luna, her full height and fury on display. "Drop them," Mike commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his ranger days. Now, the poachers hesitated, their eyes darting between Mike's rifle and Luna's teeth. Behind him, through the open door, Mike caught a glimpse of a third man, and his heart stopped. Across the man's face were 3 long scars, still red and angry. Luna saw him too. Her roar shook the cabin, filled with recognition and rage. "It's her," the scarred man gasped. "The same damn bear." "Federal law enforcement is on their way," Mike lied smoothly, keeping his rifle steady. "Drop your weapons and leave. This is your only warning." For a moment, no one moved. Then Luna took a step forward, her massive form blocking the morning light from the doorway. The poacher's nerve broke. They dropped their rifles and ran, scrambling through the snow like scared rabbits. Mike slammed the door shut, his heart pounding. Luna immediately rushed to check on her cubs, nosing them gently as they emerged from hiding. Rocky and Scout were frightened but unharmed, pressing close to their mother's warmth. "They'll be back," Mike said quietly, watching through the window as the poachers disappeared into the forest with more men and better weapons. He turned to Luna, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes. "But we'll be ready." Luna's response was to place herself between the door and her cubs, her message clear: this was her home now, and she would defend it. Mike felt a fierce pride well up in his chest. They had chosen each other, this unlikely family, and together they would face whatever came next. As the adrenaline faded, Mike sank into his chair, watching Luna comfort her cubs. The poachers had brought them together, but something stronger kept them united: trust, loyalty, and the unshakable bond between protectors. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the poachers' tracks. Inside, man and bears settled into watchful rest, knowing that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. But for now, they had each other. And sometimes, Mike realized that was enough. The rising sun cast long shadows through the trees, painting stripes across Mike's cabin. 3 days had passed since the poacher's first appearance, but the tension hadn't lifted. Luna paced near the windows, her wounds healing, but her instincts sharp. Scout and Rocky had grown stronger, playing more boldly near the fireplace, but their mother's anxiety kept them close. Mike cleaned his rifle, watching Luna's movements. They had settled into an unlikely partnership, taking turns keeping watch. When he slept, she guarded. When she rested, he patrolled. But they both knew this couldn't last forever. The crack of a branch outside shattered the morning quiet. Luna froze mid-stride, her head snapping toward the sound. Mike moved to the window, staying low. Through the frosted glass, he caught movement, not 2 or 3 figures this time, but 5. "They're back," he whispered. Luna's growl rumbled through the cabin. She immediately herded her cubs toward the safe space behind the wood storage, but this time, Scout resisted. The smaller cub had found his strength, and with it, a streak of defiance. A voice carried through the cold air. "Smoke them out. The bear's worth more alive, but dead will do." Mike's blood ran cold. He turned to Luna, seeing his own determination reflected in her dark eyes. They had prepared for this, had known it was coming, but the reality still hit him like a physical blow. The first canister crashed through the window, spewing smoke. Mike pulled his old ranger bandana over his face, moving quickly to their escape route, a trap door leading to a root cellar installed years ago for storing winter supplies. But as he reached for Scout, the cub darted away, frightened by the chaos. Luna roared, her massive form disappearing into the smoke after her cub. Mike grabbed Rocky, lowering him into the cellar. "Stay here," he commanded, though he knew the cub couldn't understand. Rocky whimpered but remained where he was placed. The smoke thickened, burning Mike's eyes as he searched for Luna and Scout. He heard glass breaking, more windows being smashed. They were running out of time. Through the haze, he saw Luna emerge, Scout dangling from her mouth. But before they could reach the trap door, the cabin's front door exploded inward. The scarred man stood there, rifle raised, his face twisted with vengeance. "Found you," he snarled. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Luna laid Scout down and charged. Her massive body moved with unexpected speed despite her healing wounds. The man fired, but the smoke threw off his aim. Luna's full weight hit him like a freight train, sending them both crashing through the doorway into the snow. Mike didn't hesitate. He scooped up Scout and ran for the cellar, dropping the cub next to his brother. The sounds of combat outside spurred him to action. He grabbed his rifle and emerged into the chaos. The scene outside was like something from a nightmare. Luna was holding her own against 2 poachers, her fury making up for her weakened state. But 3 more were closing in, rifles ready. The scarred man was getting to his feet, blood streaming from fresh claw marks across his chest. Mike took aim and fired 2 warning shots into the air. "Federal agents are on their way," he shouted, his voice carrying authority despite the lie. "Drop your weapons." One poacher hesitated, lowering his rifle. But the scarred man wasn't finished. He charged at Luna from behind, a hunting knife glinting in his hand. Without thinking, Mike tackled him, sending them both sprawling in the bloody snow. They grappled, trading punches. The man was younger, stronger, but Mike had the power of desperation. He could hear Luna dealing with the other poachers, her roars mixing with shouts of pain and fear. The knife slashed across Mike's arm, drawing blood. He countered with a headbutt that sent the scarred man reeling. As they struggled, Mike caught glimpses of the battle around them. 2 poachers were down, crawling away from Luna's fury. Another had fled into the trees. Suddenly, a high-pitched cry pierced the air. Scout had somehow followed them out and was standing in the doorway, his brother right behind him. The scarred man's eyes lit up with cruel opportunity. No. Mike's shout was drowned out by Luna's earth-shattering roar. She moved like lightning, her massive body crossing the space in seconds. The scarred man raised his knife, but he never had a chance. Luna's full weight landed on him, pinning him to the ground. Her jaws closed around his rifle arm, not crushing, but holding him immobile. The man screamed, more in terror than pain. As he stared into the eyes of the mother bear he had hunted for so long, the remaining poachers fled, leaving their fallen companion to his fate. Mike struggled to his feet, blood dripping from his arm. Luna held the scarred man down, waiting for Mike's word. "It's over," Mike said, his voice rough. Luna let him go. She hesitated, her jaws tightening slightly. The man whimpered, his bravado gone, but then Scout approached, pressing against his mother's leg, and something shifted in Luna's eyes. She released her grip and backed away, choosing mercy over vengeance. The scarred man scrambled up and ran, not looking back. Mike watched him disappear into the trees, then turned to Luna. She was already checking her cubs, nosing them for injuries, her maternal instinct overriding everything else. Mike sagged against the cabin wall, the adrenaline fading. The snow around them was trampled and bloody, telling the story of their desperate battle. But they had won. They had protected their unlikely family. As Scout and Rocky played in the snow, seemingly unaffected by the violence they had witnessed, Luna approached Mike. She pressed her massive head against his chest, a gesture of trust and gratitude that brought tears to his eyes. "We did it, girl," he whispered, wrapping his arms around her thick neck. "We really did it." The morning sun broke through the clouds, melting the bloody snow. Mike knew there would be consequences, explanations needed for the violence that had occurred here. But looking at Luna and her cubs, seeing the trust and love in their small family unit, he knew it had all been worth it. They had fought for each other, protected each other, and in doing so had forged something unbreakable. The battle was over, but their story was just beginning. Spring arrived in the Montana mountains, melting away the last traces of winter's fury. Mike sat on his cabin porch, watching Scout and Rocky wrestle in the new grass. The cubs had grown significantly over the past months, their playful antics a far cry from the desperate night when they had first arrived at his door. Luna lounged nearby, her wounds now fully healed, with the proud scars that told their story of survival. She had changed too, no longer the frightened, injured bear who had begged for shelter, but a confident mother who had found her place between two worlds. After the battle with the poachers, Mike had been forced to contact his old colleagues at Fish and Wildlife. He had expected punishment, maybe even arrest for harboring wild bears. Instead, something extraordinary had happened. The incident had exposed a major poaching ring, leading to multiple arrests and the discovery of an illegal wildlife trafficking operation. Mike smiled, remembering the face of his old supervisor when he had explained how a mother bear had chosen his cabin as sanctuary. In 30 years of wildlife service, she had said, "I've never heard anything like it." After much debate, they had reached an unprecedented decision: the bears could stay. "Look at you two troublemakers," Mike called out as Scout attempted to climb a young tree, with Rocky trying to pull him down by his back leg. Both cubs had developed distinct personalities. Scout, once the freer of the two, had become the adventurous one, always first to explore new territories. Rocky was more cautious but fiercely protective of his brother. Luna lifted her head, watching her cubs with pride. She hadn't returned to the deep forest, as Mike had initially expected. Instead, she had chosen to make her home in the woods around his cabin, close enough for daily visits, but far enough to maintain their wild nature. It was a perfect balance, one that defied everything Mike had learned about bear behavior. "Remember that first night?" Mike asked, sharing a knowing look with Luna. She moved closer, settling beside his chair with a comfortable familiarity that still amazed him. "You were quite a sight standing there in the storm," Mike continued. Luna nudged his hand with her nose, her way of acknowledging their shared history. The sound of a vehicle approaching made them all pause. Scout and Rocky immediately ran to their mother, but there was no fear in their movement. They had learned to distinguish friend from foe. Mike recognized the rumble of the Ranger Service truck. Sarah, the wildlife officer assigned to monitor their unique situation, stepped out with a warm smile. "How's our favorite family doing?" she called, carrying her usual bag of medical supplies and research equipment. Luna remained relaxed as Sarah approached, even allowing her to check the cubs' growth and development. It had become a monthly routine, part of the agreement that allowed them to stay. The data gathered from observing their unprecedented bond was proving invaluable for wildlife conservation efforts. "They're thriving," Sarah announced, making notes in her tablet. "And Luna's adaptation to the semi-wild state is remarkable. We're rewriting textbooks because of you guys." Mike nodded, watching Scout boldly approach Sarah, hoping for the treat she usually brought. "They've taught me more than I ever learned in 30 years of service," he admitted. "About trust, about family, about breaking down the barriers we think exist between species." After Sarah left, Mike prepared for their evening routine. He no longer needed to provide food. Luna had taught her cubs to forage and hunt in the surrounding woods. But they still shared moments together, especially at sunset. He built a small fire in the outdoor pit, its warmth attracting his unlikely family. Rocky and Scout crashed through the underbrush, tired from their day's adventures. They flopped down near the fire, their growing bodies still managing to look comically clumsy. Luna settled behind them, creating a protective barrier against the evening chill. "You know," Mike said, sitting in his outdoor chair, "I never thought I'd say this, but you saved me that night." He looked at Luna, who met his gaze with her usual intelligence. "I was just existing here, not really living. You gave me purpose again." Luna's response was to rest her massive head on his knee, a gesture of affection that had become natural between them. Scout and Rocky, not wanting to be left out, crowded closer, demanding their share of attention. Mike laughed, scratching behind their ears. The sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a spectacular Montana sunset that seemed to celebrate their unconventional family. In the distance, a wolf howled, and both cubs perked up their ears. Luna remained relaxed, knowing they were safe in the space between wild and tame. Mike thought about the future, about watching these cubs grow into powerful adult bears. They would never be fully wild, but neither would they be tame. They were something new, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the barrier between humans and wildlife. "We're going to have to expand the porch soon," he told Luna, chuckling as Scout attempted to squeeze into a space clearly too small for his growing frame. "These boys aren't getting any smaller." The stars began to appear, twinkling in the darkening sky. Mike stoked the fire, its warm glow illuminating their small circle. He had learned to read Luna's different growls, to understand her body language, to anticipate her needs. In return, she had learned to trust him completely, to share her cubs with him, to accept his human way of showing love. "The world could learn a lot from us," Mike mused, watching Rocky and Scout drift off to sleep, their breathing synchronizing with their mother's. About breaking down walls, about giving second chances. Luna's eyes reflected the firelight as she looked at him, and Mike saw in them the same thing he had seen that desperate night: intelligence, trust, and something that could only be described as love. They had created something miraculous here, a bridge between two worlds that most thought could never meet. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Mike felt a profound sense of peace. His cabin was no longer just a retreat from the world. It had become a sanctuary, a place where the impossible had become possible. Luna and her cubs had taught him that family wasn't about species or expectations. It was about trust, protection, and the courage to open your door to something extraordinary. The Montana mountains kept their secrets, but this one, of a man, a mother bear, and two cubs who had found each other in a storm, would be told for generations to come. A testament to the power of trust, love, and the unbreakable bonds of an unlikely family.